The shuttle descended through clouds of purple and gold as Commander Ethan Cole watched the alien world grow larger through the viewport window. And he felt his heart beat faster with each passenger moment because he had never seen anything quite so beautiful in all his 32 years of life. Volanthi Prime was a world of crystal towers and floating gardens. A planet where an ancient species had built wonders that made human cities look like children's toys. And Ethan was here as part of a diplomatic security team, meant to protect Earth's ambassador during the first major trade negotiations between their peoples. He stepped off the shuttle and immediately felt the weight of 100 silver eyes upon him. For the Volanthi were tall and graceful beings with skin that shimmered like moonlight on water and eyes that held the cold beauty of distant stars. And they looked at him the way one might look at a curious insect that had wandered into a palace. So this is a human. A voice rang out with musical tones that somehow still carried mockery within them. Ethan turned to see a young Volanthi female approaching him with slow and deliberate steps, her iridescent markings glowing with soft blue light beneath her pale skin. And she circled him like a predator examining prey that posed no real threat. Lady Salith Vernai, his briefing officer, had warned him about this one. The youngest daughter of High Matriarch Thesara, who ruled all of Volanthi Prime with wisdom accumulated over 800 years of life. "You are much smaller than I expected," Salith said, as she leaned down to examine his face with obvious amusement. "And what are these marks upon your skin? These lines and discolorations that mar your appearance so terribly?" "Scars," Ethan replied with a calm voice that betrayed none of the irritation he felt inside. "I earned them in battle over many years of service." Salith laughed, and the sound was like silver bells ringing in a cold wind. "How primitive. Our medical technology erases all such imperfections within moments. Yet you wear yours like decorations on a garment. How very strange your people must be to celebrate damage to your own bodies." Ethan simply nodded and said nothing more because he had learned long ago that some battles were not worth fighting. And besides, his job was to protect the ambassador and not to argue with alien princesses who had never known hardship in their centuries-long lives. The welcoming feast took place in a great hall of crystal and light where hundreds of Volanthi nobles gathered to observe the human delegation with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely hidden contempt. And Ethan stood at his post near the matriarch's table while Salith continued her campaign of gentle humiliation. "Do humans truly need to consume dead organic matter multiple times each day?" she asked loudly enough for nearby nobles to hear. "And I am told you must also lose consciousness for hours at a time, or your minds begin to fail. Is this true?" "We call it eating and sleeping," Ethan responded with a slight smile. "And yes, we find both activities quite enjoyable, actually." "Enjoyable?" Salith's markings flickered with bright amusement. "To be so dependent on such base functions and to find joy in them. Your species is endlessly fascinating in its simplicity." The matriarch. Zara watched this exchange from her elevated seat with ancient eyes that seemed to see far more than they revealed. And Ethan noticed that she did not join in her daughter's laughter, but instead studied him with an intensity that made him slightly uncomfortable. "Tell me, human," Salith continued as she gestured at his mouth, "why are your teeth so blunt and useless? They look like they could barely tear through soft fruit, let alone serve any defensive purpose." "We learned to make tools and weapons," Ethan said simply. "So we did not need sharp teeth to survive." "Ah, yes. Your famous tools," Salith smiled with condescension. "Because your bodies are so weak that you require external objects to accomplish what other species do naturally." "How very clever of you to compensate for your many deficiencies." Ethan was about to respond when something caught his attention at the edge of his vision. A flicker of movement among the servants near the eastern entrance. that did not match the graceful patterns of Volante motion. And his body tensed with instincts honed by 14 years of combat experience. Everything happened in the span of 3 heartbeats. The first heartbeat brought the sight of a weapon being raised by a figure in servant's clothing. The barrel aimed directly at Matriarch Thesara's head with deadly precision. The second heartbeat saw Ethan already in motion, his legs driving him forward with explosive force that surprised even himself. As pure adrenaline flooded his system, and time seemed to slow around him, the third heartbeat ended with Ethan throwing his body between the Matriarch and the plasma bolt that screamed through the air with killing intent. And he felt the searing heat tear through his shoulder, even as his hand found his sidearm and returned fire with 3 precise shots. 3 attackers fell before Ethan hit the ground. And even as his blood began to pool on the crystal floor, he was scanning for additional threats, with eyes that refused to close despite the agony that radiated through his entire body. The great hall erupted into chaos with screaming nobles and rushing guards. But Ethan heard none of it because his focus remained fixed on his duty until the security team confirmed that no other assassins remained. And only then did he allow himself to feel the full weight of his wound. Sealith stood frozen in place with her silver eyes wide and her glowing markings dimmed to almost nothing as she stared at the human who lay bleeding on the floor. And she could not understand what she had just witnessed. He had moved so fast that even her superior Volante senses had barely tracked his motion. And he had placed his fragile human body between death and her mother without a moment of hesitation, without any calculation of personal cost, without any reason at all, except that it was simply what he did. Medical team now. Someone was shouting as Volante physicians rushed forward with their advanced equipment. But they paused in confusion because they had never treated a human before, and his biology was strange and unfamiliar to them. Ethan looked up at the faces surrounding him and managed to speak through gritted teeth. The Matriarch? Is she safe? She is unharmed. A guard confirmed with obvious surprise at the human's priorities. Good, Ethan said, as his vision began to darken at the edges. That is good. Sealith watched the physicians carry the unconscious human away, and she found that her hands were trembling for the first time in her 200 years of life. And she realized that everything she thought she knew about humans had just been shattered like glass against stone. She had mocked his scars, but now she understood that each one represented a moment like this. A moment when he had chosen to stand between someone else and death. And she felt something unfamiliar growing in her chest. It might have been shame. Her mother's voice came from behind her, calm and thoughtful despite the chaos that still swirled through the hall. Now you see, my daughter, why I agreed to let the humans send their warriors. They are not what they appear to be. Sealith could only nod as she continued to stare at the blood on the crystal floor. The red human blood that looked so bright and wrong against the pale Volante architecture. And she wondered if the strange small creature with the blunt teeth and the primitive scars would even survive the night. She found herself hoping very strongly that he would. The medical wing of the Volante Palace was a place of soft light and humming machines that Sealith had visited perhaps twice in her entire 200 years of existence. For her people rarely suffered injuries that required such attention, and illness was almost unknown among their kind. Yet, here she stood for the 5th time in 3 days, watching through a window of crystalline glass as the human warrior lay unconscious on a bed designed for bodies much taller than his own. The physicians were baffled, and she could hear their confused discussions. Whenever she passed through the corridor, their voices carrying tones of wonder and disbelief that she had never heard from Volante medical professionals. Before, his cells are replicating at an impossible rate, one doctor reported to his colleagues with obvious amazement in his voice. The wound that should have killed him is already closing, and new tissue is forming faster than our instruments can measure. But the energy expenditure required for such rapid healing should have depleted his body completely. Another physician argued with frustration. By all logic, he should be dead, or at least in a permanent comatose state. Yet his vital signs grow stronger with each passing hour. Humans call it adrenaline and survival instinct. A third voice offered hesitantly. I have been reading their medical literature, and it seems their species evolved under conditions of extreme predation that selected for aggressive biological responses to trauma. Salith listened to these conversations and felt her understanding of the universe shifting beneath her feet like sand in a storm. For she had been taught since childhood that humans were a young and primitive species barely worth acknowledging. Yet this one human had done things that defied everything she thought she knew. On the fourth day, Ethan opened his eyes and immediately tried to sit up, before a Volante nurse gently pushed him back down with an expression of fond exasperation. And Salith found herself walking through the door before she had consciously decided to do so. You are awake, she said with a voice that sounded strange and uncertain even to her own ears. The physicians were not sure when you would regain consciousness given the severity of your injuries. Ethan turned his head to look at her, and she saw recognition in his dark human eyes, along with something that might have been amusement. Lady Salith, have you come to mock my fragile human body some more? Because I warn you that my wit may be somewhat dulled by the pain medication. The words hit her like a physical blow, and she felt heat rising to her cheeks in a display of embarrassment that she had not experienced since she was a child of 20 years. I did not come to mock you. I came to see how you were recovering. Ah, Ethan said, with a slight nod that made him wince. Well, in that case, I am recovering quite well according to your doctors, who seem very surprised that I have not died yet. They say your body heals itself with aggressive persistence. Salith replied as she moved closer to his bed and examined the bandages that covered his shoulder. They have never seen anything like it in all their centuries of practice. Humans are stubborn, Ethan said with a small smile that transformed his scarred face into something almost handsome. We do not give up easily whether we are fighting enemies or fighting our own wounds. Salith pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down without asking permission, because she suddenly had so many questions burning inside her mind that she could not bear to leave. The scars I mocked when you first arrived, how did you receive them? Ethan was quiet for a moment, and she thought perhaps she had offended him. But then he began to speak in a soft voice that carried the weight of many memories, both painful and proud. This one on my jaw came from a knife fight in a place called Jakarta when I was 20 years old and foolish enough to think I was invincible, he said as he touched the thin white line. This one across my forearm happened when I pulled a child from a burning building and a beam collapsed on top of us. The child lived, and I considered that a fair trade. He continued pointing to scars and telling their stories, each one a chapter in a life that had been filled with violence and sacrifice and moments of impossible courage. And Salith found herself leaning forward with her silver eyes wide as she absorbed every word. You have done all this in only 32 years? She asked when he finally fell silent, her voice carrying a note of disbelief that was different from her earlier mockery. Humans do not have the luxury of time that your people enjoy, Ethan replied with a shrug that made him wince again. We know that our lives are short, so we try to fill them with as much meaning as possible. Every moment matters, because we never know which one might be our last. That sounds exhausting, Salith said honestly. It is. Ethan agreed with a laugh that turned into a cough. But it is also exhilarating in a way that I cannot fully explain. Knowing that each day could be your final one makes you appreciate things that might otherwise seem ordinary. Salith considered this perspective and found that it challenged something fundamental in her Volante worldview. For her people measured their lives in centuries and treated each decade as merely another chapter in an endless story. But humans apparently experienced existence with an intensity that she could barely imagine. Why did you do it? She asked the question that had been haunting her since that terrible night in the Great Hall. Why did you throw yourself in front of that weapon when you knew it could kill you? Ethan looked at her with an expression she could not quite read. Because it was the right thing to do. Because protecting others is what gives my life purpose. Because in that moment, I did not think about whether I would live or die. I simply acted on instinct and training. But you owed my mother nothing. Salith pressed further. You had no obligation to sacrifice yourself for someone you had just met. I do not need an obligation to help someone in danger. Ethan said simply, that is just who I am. That is who humans try to be, even when we fail more often than we succeed. Salith sat in silence as she processed these words, and she felt something shifting in her chest. A warmth that spread through her body like sunlight breaking through clouds after a long storm. And she realized that she had been completely wrong about this strange small creature. I am sorry, she said finally with a voice that trembled slightly, for the things I said about you and your scars. I was cruel and ignorant, and you deserve better treatment, especially since you were a guest in our home. Ethan smiled again, and this time the expression reached his eyes. Apology accepted, and for what it is worth, I found your teasing more amusing than offensive. You reminded me of my younger sister, who also enjoys making fun of me whenever possible. You have a sister? Salith asked with sudden curiosity. I have a sister and 2 brothers and parents who worry about me constantly. Ethan confirmed. Humans form strong family bonds, even though we know we will eventually lose each other. Perhaps that makes our connections even more precious. They talked for hours that day and for many days afterward as Ethan slowly recovered and Salith slowly learned what it meant to be human. And she discovered that behind the primitive exterior was a depth of emotion and experience that rivaled anything in her own. Ancient culture, her mother Lasara watched these conversations through the security monitors with ancient eyes that held secrets Salith could not yet imagine. And the matriarch smiled with satisfaction as she opened a very old book filled with laws that had not been spoken aloud in 300 years. Salith discovered the truth by accident on a morning when the twin sons of Volanti Prime cast long shadows through the palace corridors. She had been walking past her mother's private study when she heard voices speaking in the formal dialect reserved for legal matters of great importance. She paused outside the door and listened because curiosity had always been both her greatest strength and her most persistent weakness. And what she heard made her blood turn cold in her veins. The right of Vethalar has been invoked, her mother's voice declared with calm certainty. The human warrior Ethan Cole placed his body and his life between death and the matriarch of house, Vernai without contract or obligation. By the ancient laws, this action binds him to our house for the remainder of his existence. But matriarch, another voice protested with obvious concern. This law has not been used in over 300 years, and it has never been applied to an alien species. Surely there must be some exception or provision that would release him from this bond. There is no exception, Dazara replied firmly. The Codex of Bonds is clear and absolute in its language. Any being who offers their life in defense of our bloodline without prior agreement becomes Vethalar, the bound one. And this status cannot be revoked by any authority including the bound one themselves. Salith burst through the door with fury blazing in her silver eyes. Mother, what have you done? Dazara looked up from the ancient book spread open on her desk, and her expression remained perfectly serene in the face of her daughter's anger. I have done nothing, Salith. The human did this to himself when he chose to act as he did. He does not even know. Salith shouted with her markings flashing bright red in distress. You are claiming ownership of a person who has no idea what happened. This is wrong. This is slavery by another name." The advisor who had been speaking with Dasara quietly excused himself and fled the room, because no one wanted to be present when mother and daughter engaged in battle. And the door closed behind him with a soft click that seemed very loud in the sudden silence. "Sit down," Dasara commanded in a voice that brooked no argument. And Salith found herself obeying despite her anger, because 800 years of authority was not easily defied. The right of Vethelor is not slavery. Dasara explained with patient tones as if teaching a child. It is a sacred bond of mutual obligation that honors the sacrifice of the one who offered their life. The bound warrior gains status equal to any blood member of our house. They receive our protection and our resources and our loyalty in return for what they have given. But he did not choose this. Salith argued with desperation creeping into her voice. He saved your life because that is simply who he is, not because he wanted to be bound to an alien family forever. And that is precisely why the bond is so sacred, Dasara replied as she closed the ancient book with gentle reverence. The right can only be invoked by those who act without selfish motivation, by those who offer everything and expect nothing in return. Do you not see how rare and precious such souls are? Salith felt tears forming in her eyes, which shocked her because she had not cried since she was a child of 30 years. "I mocked him, Mother. I made fun of his scars and his biology and his primitive human ways. And the whole time he was becoming bound to our family, how do I face him knowing what I did?" "You face him with honesty and humility," Dasara said, as she rose from her chair and moved to stand before her daughter. "You have already begun this process by spending time with him and learning about his people. I have watched you grow closer to him, and I am proud of the change I see in you. You planned this," Salith accused with sudden realization. "You knew what would happen if you allowed human warriors to guard you. You knew their nature would compel them to act as he did," Dasara smiled. And it was the smile of someone who had lived for 8 centuries and learned to see patterns that younger minds could not perceive. "I suspected it was possible, yes. Humans have a reputation among the older species of the galaxy for exactly this kind of selfless courage. They are known as the species that runs toward danger rather than away from it." "Why?" Salith demanded. "Why would you want to bind an alien to our house? What purpose does this serve?" "Our house grows weak," Dasara admitted with a heaviness in her voice that Salith had never heard before. "We have lived in comfort and safety for too long, and our warriors have forgotten what it means to truly fight. The assassination attempt proved this beyond any doubt because not a single Valanti guard moved fast enough to save me." She placed her hands on Salith's shoulders and looked into her daughter's eyes with an intensity that was almost frightening. But the human moved. The human with his short life and his scarred body and his primitive instincts moved faster than any of our people could have imagined. And he did so without hesitation because protecting others is written into his very soul. You want him to teach us." Salith whispered as understanding finally dawned. "I want him to remind us of what we have forgotten," Dasara corrected gently. "I want him to show our people that courage is not about living forever, but about being willing to die for something greater than yourself." Salith pulled away from her mother and began pacing the room as her mind raced through the implications of everything she had learned. "He deserves to know. He deserves to make his own choice about whether to accept this bond." "He will know," Dasara agreed. "I intended to tell him once he had fully recovered. But perhaps it would be better if the news came from you, since you have developed a connection with him that transcends our formal diplomatic arrangements." "Me?" Salith stopped pacing and stared at her mother with wide eyes. "You want me to tell him that he is now legally bound to our family forever?" "I think he will receive the news better from someone he considers a friend," Dasara said simply. "And do not pretend that you have not come to care for him." I have seen the way you look at him and the way you light up when you speak of your conversations. Salith wanted to deny it, but she could not because her mother spoke the truth. Somewhere between the mocking and the apologies and the long talks about human life, she had begun to feel something for the strange small warrior that defied easy explanation. What if he hates us for this? She asked in a small voice that sounded nothing like the confident noble who had teased a human at a diplomatic feast. Then we will bear his hatred with honor, Desara replied. But I do not think hatred is what awaits you when you speak with him. Humans are a surprising species, and I believe Ethan Cole will surprise you most of all. Salith left her mother's study with heavy steps and a heavier heart, and she walked toward the medical wing where Ethan was preparing to be discharged after his miraculous recovery. And she tried to imagine how she would tell him that his act of heroism had cost him his freedom. She did not know that her entire understanding of human nature was about to change once again. Ethan was sitting on the edge of his bed in the medical wing when Silith arrived. He had already changed from the patient robes into his formal uniform, and he looked almost like the same man who had stepped off the shuttle weeks ago, except for the new scar on his shoulder that joined the collection of marks on his body. Lady Salith. He greeted her with a warm smile that made her heart ache with guilt. I was hoping you would come by before I returned to my quarters. I wanted to thank you for keeping me company during my recovery. Please do not thank me, Salith said quickly as she closed the door behind her and leaned against it as if she needed the support to remain standing. There is something I must tell you, and I do not know how to say it. Ethan's expression shifted from friendly warmth to careful attention, the change happening so smoothly that Salith realized she was seeing the warrior beneath the pleasant exterior. You look troubled. What has happened? Nothing has happened. Salith struggled to find the right words because no combination of syllables seemed adequate for what she needed to convey. Or rather, something happened weeks ago and I only just learned about it. She moved away from the door and began pacing because standing still felt impossible. And Ethan watched her with patient silence that somehow made everything harder. When you saved my mother, Salith finally began with her voice trembling. When you threw yourself between her and that weapon without any obligation to do so, you triggered an ancient law that has not been used in 300 years. Ethan remained silent, but his eyes narrowed slightly as he processed this information. The rite of Vethalar, Salith continued as she forced herself to meet his gaze. It states that any being who offers their life in defense of our bloodline, without prior contract, becomes bound to House Vernai. My mother says this bond cannot be broken by any authority, not even by you. Bound. Ethan repeated the word slowly as if testing its weight on his tongue. What exactly does that mean in practical terms? It means you are legally and spiritually tied to our house forever, Salith explained with misery thick in her voice. You cannot leave without our permission. You cannot refuse orders from the matriarch. You are essentially property of House Vernai by ancient Volanti law. She expected him to explode with anger or demand to speak with his ambassador or threaten diplomatic consequences. But instead, Ethan simply sat quietly for a long moment with an unreadable expression on his scarred face. I am so sorry. Salith rushed to fill the terrible silence. My mother knew this might happen when she agreed to let human warriors guard her. She manipulated you and used your nature against you. And I think what she did was wrong, even if she had reasons that seemed good to her. Does this bond go both ways? Ethan asked with a calm voice that surprised her completely. What do you mean? Salith stopped pacing and stared at him in confusion. I am bound to protect your house, Ethan explained slowly. But does your house have obligations to me in return? Or is this purely a relationship where I give and you take? Salith had not expected this question, and she had to search her memory of her mother's explanation before answering. The Codex says the bound warrior receives full status as house family. You would have our protection and our resources and a voice in House decisions and a place at our table for as long as you live. A place at your table, Ethan repeated with something strange entering his voice that Salith could not identify. A family. I know that cannot make up for losing your freedom, Salith said desperately. And we can try to find some legal provision to release you. My mother says it is impossible, but there must be scholars who've studied the ancient texts more deeply. Perhaps there is something she missed. Salith. Ethan interrupted her rambling with a gentle tone that made her fall silent immediately. May I ask you something personal? She nodded because her voice seemed to have abandoned her. Do you know what I have been doing for the last 14 years of my life? Ethan stood from the bed and walked toward her with slow, deliberate steps. I have been a soldier. I have fought for governments that saw me as expendable and for causes that often turned out to be less noble than advertised. I have watched friends die, and I have killed enemies who were probably just following orders same as me. He stopped an arm's length away from her and looked up into her silver eyes with an expression that held depths. She was only beginning to understand. In all that time, no one has ever offered me a home. No one has ever said that I belong somewhere permanently. I have always been a tool to be used and discarded when my usefulness ended. That sounds terrible, Salith whispered. It is the life I chose, Ethan acknowledged with a shrug. And I do not regret it because I have saved lives and protected innocent people and done work that mattered. But I would be lying if I said I never dreamed of something different. Something different? Salith found herself holding her breath without knowing why. A family, Ethan said simply. A place where I belonged, not because of what I could do, but because of who I am. People who would stand beside me, not because they were ordered to, but because they wanted to. He reached out and took her hand in his, which was a gesture of startling intimacy among the Lanthi culture. You are telling me that your ancient law offers me exactly that. A family and a home and a permanent place in this universe. And you expect me to be angry? You did not choose this, Salith argued weakly, even as her fingers curled around his. It was forced upon you without your knowledge or consent. Many of the best things in life come to us without choosing, Ethan replied with a smile that seemed to light up his entire face. I did not choose to be born human. I did not choose the instincts that made me jump in front of that weapon. But I would not change either of those things because they led me here to this moment. You are not going to demand release? Salith asked with wonder and confusion mixing in her voice. What are my new duties? Ethan asked instead of answering her question. If I am to be the bound warrior of House Brunei, then I should probably learn what that entails. Salith stared at him for a long moment, and then she did something she had not done since she was a child. She began to laugh and cry at the same time, while clutching the hand of a human warrior who had just chosen her family over his own freedom. You are insane, she managed to say between laughs and tears. All humans must be completely insane. Probably, Ethan agreed with warmth in his dark eyes. But I have found that a little insanity makes life much more interesting. He squeezed her hand gently, and Salith felt something shift in her chest that she recognized as the beginning of an emotion she had never expected to feel. For any being, let alone a short-lived human with blunt teeth and primitive scars. Come, she said as she wiped her eyes with her free hand while keeping the other firmly clasped in his. My mother will want to hear your decision, and we have much to discuss about your new role in our house. They walked out of the medical wing together, and Salith realized that for the first time in her 200 years of existence, she was genuinely excited about what the future might bring. 6 months passed on Volanthi Prime, and in that time the human warrior became a legend that spread across the entire planet, like fire through dry grass. Children spoke his name in the streets, and warriors whispered about his methods in their training halls, and scholars wrote lengthy documents analyzing what his presence meant for Volanti society, Ethan Cole had become something no alien had ever been before. A true member of a noble Volanti house, with all the rights and responsibilities that status entailed. And he had embraced his new role with an enthusiasm that surprised everyone except perhaps Salith, who had learned to expect the unexpected from her human. Again, Ethan shouted at the young Volanti warriors assembled before him in the palace training grounds, his voice carrying authority that had nothing to do with his smaller stature. Your form is beautiful, but beauty does not win battles. Speed and efficiency and the willingness to get hurt while hurting your enemy, that is what wins battles. The warriors nodded and resumed their drills with renewed intensity, because they had learned that the human's criticism came from a place of genuine care. He wanted them to survive, and he pushed them hard precisely because he knew what waited for them in the real world, beyond the palace. While Selith watched from the observation platform with her mother beside her, and she marveled at how much had changed since that night when a plasma bolt had set everything in motion. He is good with them, Dazara observed with satisfaction in her ancient voice. Better than I had hoped when I first conceived this plan. They respect him, Selith agreed. Not because of his title or his connection to our house, but because he has bled for what he teaches. They can see the truth of his lessons written on his body. And how do you feel about him? Dazara asked with a knowing smile that made Salith's cheeks flush with embarrassment. Mother, that is not appropriate. Salith protested weakly. I am 800 years old, and I am your mother. Dazara replied calmly. Everything is appropriate when it concerns the happiness of my youngest daughter. Salith was saved from answering by a commotion at the entrance to the training grounds, where a group of nobles from House Velthol had arrived with expressions of barely contained hostility on their elegant faces. Matriarch Thesara, the leader of the group, called out with formal politeness that dripped with underlying contempt. We come to challenge your claim on the alien creature you call a bound warrior. The training stopped immediately as every warrior turned to watch the confrontation, and Ethan moved to stand beside Salith and Thesara, with his hand resting casually near his weapon. On what grounds do you challenge? Thesara asked with perfect calm, as if discussing the weather rather than a serious political attack. The Rite of Vethalar was designed for Volanthi, the House Volthor. Noble declared loudly enough for everyone present to hear. It was never intended to apply to primitive alien species who cannot possibly understand the sacred nature of the bond. We demand that the creature be released from its illegal bondage. I see, Dazara said thoughtfully, and if I refuse this demand, then House Velthor will bring this matter before the Council of Houses, the noble threatened with confidence. And we will expose your perversion of our ancient traditions for all to see. Salith felt rage building in her chest, and she stepped forward with her markings blazing bright with anger. You speak of perversion while ignoring the truth of what happened. Ethan Cole saved my mother's life without any thought for himself. He acted with more honor in that single moment than your entire house has shown in 3 centuries. The noble's eyes narrowed with hatred. You dare speak to me in such a manner? You who have clearly been corrupted by proximity to the alien. Perhaps House Vernai needs new leadership that has not been tainted by human influence. Enough, Ethan said in a quiet voice that somehow cut through all other sound. And he stepped past Salith to face the noble directly, despite being a full head shorter than the Volanthi. I did not ask to be bound to House Vernai. Ethan continued with steady calm. I did not know such a thing was possible when I chose to protect the matriarch. But I have accepted this bond willingly, and I will tell you why. The noble sneered down at him. I have no interest in the reasons of a primitive creature who should be fighting for scraps on his backward homeworld. You call me primitive, Ethan acknowledged without any sign of offense. And perhaps by your standards I am. My species lives for less than a century, while yours endures for nearly 1,000 years. We lack your advanced technology and your refined culture and your elegant biology." He paused and looked around at the gathered crowd before continuing. "But we have something that your people seem to have forgotten in all your centuries of comfort and safety. We remember what it means to fight for something greater than ourselves." Bold words from a creature who bleeds when scratched. The noble mocked. "Yes, I bleed," Ethan agreed with a smile that held no warmth. "I bleed and I scar, and I will eventually die in a span of time that seems like nothing to your people. But I will spend every moment of my brief existence protecting those I love and fighting for what I believe in." He stepped closer to the noble, and his voice dropped to a tone that made several warriors shiver despite themselves. "Can you say the same, Lord of House Velther? When did you last bleed for anything that mattered?" The noble had no answer, and his silence spoke louder than any words could have. "Ethan Cole is not our property," Saileth declared as she moved to stand beside him with her hand finding his in a gesture that made several nobles gasp with shock. "He is our family. He chose us, and we chose him. That is the true nature of the bond, and no council can dissolve what the heart has decided." Zara smiled with pride at her daughter's words and added her own voice to the declaration. "House Renai stands with our bound warrior. If House Velther wishes to challenge this before the council, they are welcome to try. But I suspect they will find few allies among houses who have witnessed the courage and honor this human has displayed." The noble from House Velther looked around at the watching crowd and saw no support for his position. Only respect for the scarred human who stood without fear before enemies who towered over him. And he realized that this battle was already lost. "This is not over," he warned as he retreated with his entourage. But everyone present knew his words were empty threats from a wounded pride. Later that night, Saileth found Ethan standing on a balcony overlooking the crystal city as the twin moons rose in the purple sky. And she joined him in silence because some moments did not need words. "Thank you," she finally said after several minutes of peaceful quiet. "For what?" Ethan asked without looking away from the moons. "For choosing us," Saileth replied softly. "For giving my people a chance to remember who we once were." Ethan turned to face her, and she saw something in his dark eyes that made her breath catch in her throat. "Your people gave me something I thought I would never have. A home and a family and someone who looks at me like I am more than just a weapon to be aimed at enemies. You are so much more than that," Saileth whispered as she leaned down to rest her forehead against his in a gesture of Volante intimacy that she had never shared with anyone before. "I know I will not live as long as you," Ethan said quietly. "I know that my brief human lifespan is nothing compared to the centuries you will experience. Then we will make every moment count." Saileth replied with words that echoed what he had once told her. "Because that is what humans do, and I find myself wanting to learn how to live like that." Ethan laughed softly and the sound filled Saileth's heart with a warmth she had never known before. And she understood finally that the bond between them had grown far beyond ancient laws and formal obligations. They stood together on that balcony as the moons traced their slow paths across the sky. A human warrior and a Volante noble, united by choice rather than circumstance. And both of them knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them side by side. Because some bonds cannot be measured in years or centuries, but only in the depth of connection between two souls who found each other across the vast emptiness of space, and that kind of bond truly does last forever.